and it starts you on the right path. So seeing people change and keep their sobriety like I have, my hope is that people will relate to it.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Am I my brother's keeper? At the center of this lies the question of burden of responsibility. Who bears the burden of responsibility? Is it Matthew Perry? Is it his alone, or is it everyone else's? Or a bit of both? In terms of your life, who bears the burden of responsibility? You, other people, or a combination of you and other people? Was this an accident, foul play, or something in between? Perhaps an accident waiting to happen?
We talked a little bit, and as we were done talking, he turned around. He turned me around and said, "Just remember, it's not your fault." And I went, "What?" He said, "It's not your fault." And I went, "Say that again." "It's not your fault." And I said, "What do you mean it's not my fault? I'm the one who's doing it. What do you mean?" And he explained addiction and alcohol to me, and he saved my life.
Before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I'm an author of a number of books. I do have a policy on this channel where I don't tend to cover cases that involve drugs, just because it's a very typical scenario that plays out there, although I do believe drugs were an important factor in the murder of Meredith Kercher and also to some extent in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. But for me personally, I have kind of a high discipline, high personal responsibility approach to something like addiction, where I really feel like it is your personal responsibility to sort it out, although there should be people around you that support you and are helping you get where you need to go. In other words, not enablers. And I think the problem with Matthew Perry was that he had something like 5 enablers, all these people that are charged, not helping him. But that does raise the question, who's the buck supposed to stop with? His doctors? With him? Where? In any event, if you find this analysis worthwhile, let me know in the comments. You can like, share, leave a comment. Also, you can hit the thanks button, and let's get started.
While we're shooting this movie, it's been pretty well documented that I had some problems with alcoholism and addiction. And before this movie was over, I left the film to go get help. And it was kind of.
How are you doing now?
Oh, I'm doing great. Yeah. I'm doing really great.
And this is.
Thanks.
Now, I was reading an article in the New York Times about Matthew Perry's memoir. It starts with the prologue. "Hi, my name is Matthew. Although you may know me by another name, my friends call me Maddie, and I should be dead. I am no saint, none of us are, but once you have been at death's door and you don't die, you would think that you would be bathed in relief and gratitude, but that isn't it at all. Instead, you look at the difficult road ahead of you to get better, and you are pissed. Something else happens as well. You are plagued by this nagging question, why have I been spared?" He wrote in this book. "I've said this for a long time. When I die, I don't want friends to be the first thing that's mentioned. I want helping people to be the first thing that's mentioned, and I'm going to live the rest of my life proving that." Well, instead, tragically, Perry disproved that less than a year later.
55 Vicodin a day, which is where I was.
55?
Yeah.
How did you get 55 a day?
Well, I had to wake up and realize that I needed to get 55 of them, or I was going to be really sick. So I did all sorts of things. I had a bunch of doctors, fake migraines, and all that stuff.
Matthew Perry also wrote in his book, "The best thing about me, bar none, is if somebody comes up to me and says, 'I can't stop drinking, can you help me?' I can say yes and follow up and do it." Now, in true crime, we often find someone who's a perpetrator, a suspect, and we mercilessly examine potential red flags. Are they being honest? And this cuts very close to home, doesn't it? Because Matthew Perry is a superstar, is a very much loved icon of television and someone that is part of our collective memory. And so we don't want to villainize him, we don't want to criticize him, and we don't want to really do anything that would find fault with him. And yet when he's saying these things about getting over addiction, is he telling the truth? Is he credible? And I don't even want to answer that question at face value. I want to ask you whether you are willing to look into his eyes and look into his face and say, do I believe what is being said here? And I think the answer is no. I don't want to have that conversation. But I think the flip side of that is, what if it's simply a matter of being honest? It's simply a matter of, well, if you're going to write a book about sobriety and all of that, and you might say, wow, you're being really cruel. But isn't that really the bottom line here? Because the entire fabric of addiction is a lie. It's being dishonest with yourself. It's being dishonest with society. And no one is saying being honest with oneself or being honest with society is easy. No one's saying that. I'm simply saying the cure to living a lie is starting to tell the truth, getting into the habit of telling the truth. Is it unfair of me to say that? Now, ironically, Perry's legacy could have been, should have been, or would have been all about that very thing about being his brother's keeper, that he was looking out for other addicts. Except, and I say this with compassion, he failed at keeping himself. He failed at managing himself. He failed at looking after himself. Whose responsibility is it to be honest with ourselves? I mean, if you can't be honest with yourself, who is going to get you to that place? You know, and if near-death experiences aren't going to do it, what is going to do it? When Matthew Perry did PR to promote his book, it was all about how ready he was to write it, but from the point of view of recovery. And so he said, I wanted to share when I was safe from going into the dark side of everything. This is what he told People magazine. I had to wait until I was pretty safely sober and away from the active disease of alcoholism and addiction to write it all down. And the main thing was I was pretty certain that it would help people. Now, again, without going into this into too much detail, I know it would be upsetting for a lot of people. In the interviews he gives, he doesn't look particularly happy. In the interviews he gives, he doesn't look particularly healthy. And I'm sorry to say, just my own personal impression is he doesn't look particularly convincing to me either. According to People magazine, Perry opens his memoir with the revelation that he almost died a few years ago at age 49, publicly acknowledging at the time that he suffered from a gastrointestinal perforation. The actor had actually spent weeks fighting for his life after his colon burst from opioid overuse. He spent 2 weeks in a coma and 5 months in the hospital and had to use a colostomy bag for 9 months.
6,000 AA meetings, therapy 30 years, 15 rehabs, maybe at least. Half of your life in treatment or in sober living houses. He has been in detox, he estimates, 65 times.
So, again, let's ask this question sensitively. Is it enough to tell other people what your problems are? Is sharing, communicating, for the lack of a better word, is that enough? Or does there need to be an inward shift in someone's character, in who a person is, in a person's identity, in their value system, something that is invisible, something that is beyond words, something that someone resolves to do inwardly, privately, personally. The article in People ends with the most ironic of ironies. My story is filled with hope because here I am. But the inverse turned out to be the greater, more enduring truth. His story is actually filled with terror and despair because here I am not. It really is tragic. It really is heartbreaking. You know, despite all of these near-death experiences, and again, not to sound unsympathetic, but Perry didn't have genuine resilience. And despite all the coulda, woulda, and shouldas in the world, despite the very Chandler Bingness of his wanting to help others, he couldn't help himself. If you're offended, if you're sitting there feeling offended by this stating of the obvious, this is likely the heart of the problem. Please don't state the obvious. Please don't face the obvious. Perry was in a kind of chronic denial where even after writing a book and having his book out there, he was still in denial. Everyone knows by now Perry's last words were to be given a super high dose. He said, shoot me up with a big one.
On the day that Perry died, the actor's personal assistant admits giving him 3 separate injections of ketamine, a hospital-grade anesthetic. The last dose came after Perry allegedly told Kenneth Iwamasa to, quote, shoot me with the big one.
If we are supposed to learn something from this, and let me just ask the question in a different way, are we supposed to learn something from this? You might say, no, it's just a tragic story. But Matthew Perry wrote a book because he wanted others to learn from this. So should we try to learn something from this? Should we or shouldn't we? Well, let's try. We could either try and learn from Perry himself. We can try to learn from his book. We can try to learn from his life. We can try to learn from his death. I don't think the lesson is to be softer and more flexible and more self-pitying of ourselves. I don't think the lesson is less self-discipline. I think the lesson is real authenticity. I've said it earlier. I think the lesson is just simply the courage to be honest. And I would wager the lesson is actually this. If we do not have a stronger, stricter approach to reality, but rather we prefer a softer, sentimental approach, and you might say, please, in terms of your analysis here, please take a softer, sentimental approach. That's more appropriate. You know, if we don't take a stronger, stricter approach to reality, and we prefer the sentimental approach to meaning well, but failing to actually execute on that meaning well, then there are going to be catastrophic consequences. Perry's death from a drug overdose now makes many of the noble sentiments expressed in his memoir ring a little hollow. It's not nice to say that, but then what happened to him isn't nice either. Unfortunately, this is a well-traveled path for many addicts. I know one or two. And I know that talk is cheap and actions speak louder than words. But in the end, who is responsible for our lives? Us or someone else? Am I my brother's keeper? That's what it comes down to. And there it is. At the center of this lies the question of burden of responsibility. Who bears the burden of responsibility? In Matthew Perry's case, is it Matthew Perry? Is it his alone, or is it everyone else's, or a bit of both? And of course, we've been here before. Elvis Presley, Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston. Elvis's doctor was acquitted of all charges. Michael Jackson's doctor was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, sentenced to 4 years in prison, but then he was paroled after serving just short of half that sentence. You know, somebody dies and they are gone from us permanently, and the person who was around him gets basically 2 years. But who's really responsible here? Whitney Houston, who died in a similar fashion to Matthew Perry, except in a bathtub, also had sedatives in her system. Who is responsible for that? Did you know that Whitney Houston's daughter, Bobby Christina Brown, was also found unresponsive in a bathtub and later died? Her boyfriend was found legally responsible, but not charged with a crime. If we take Elvis, Michael, and Whitney, we have 3 different legal outcomes. Do you remember Anne Hesh? She would have been charged with felony DUI, except she died of her horrific burn injuries. And so here we have a situation where a famous actor died, and those around him have been charged for his death. So why is the Rust incident with Alec Baldwin so different? That was a situation where a cinematographer died and the producer was right there in the same building. Oh, but we shouldn't charge anyone for not looking out for her, for not being our sister's keeper, even when there was a smoking gun pointed right at her. Really? Interesting. Denial is definitely interesting. Am I my brother's keeper? I would say the answer to this is that everyone should take personal responsibility for their own lives. And yes, as social animals, as conscious beings, we all bear a secondary responsibility to those around us as well. That's why when you get into a car and you're intoxicated, you have a duty towards other human beings. It's not just your own safety that matters, it's the safety of other people. If we fail at the first, meaning if we fail at taking personal responsibility, well then whatever our intentions, we are bullshitters. If we fail at taking personal responsibility, then we shouldn't try and lecture other people and try and be leaders in any particular sense. Then we are bullshitters. Bullshitting ourselves and bullshitting others. The path out of the land of bullshit is taking personal responsibility. And taking personal responsibility is not blaming anyone but ourselves. And that's a forbidden kingdom for most addicts, for most people who see themselves as victims. And there's great power in taking personal responsibility because you have the power to change. You say, I am responsible. I do blame myself. No one can change this but me. And then the change happens. And it is all dependent, how much of it is all dependent on you. That is when your identity comes into its own, when you say, this is who I am. Anyway, I hope that is helpful. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.